Stay close to the microphone. It's security. My presentation this morning is Two Competing Visions for Restoration, based on the text 2 Chronicles 36:23 and Matthew 28:16-20. Well, you probably don't see too many discipleship presentations with the books of Chronicles, one or two Chronicles, as one of the texts being presented. And what I'm suggesting here is that this text provides a background for the Great Commission passage. And hopefully, my goal is to really help us see how that background text contributes to our understanding of the Great Commission in Matthew's narration of the Gospel of Jesus. Just a few quick points about the books of Chronicles. They're post-exilic writings that provide kind of a canonical history of Israel after the exile and return. So that's important, the timing of these writings. But often they've been kind of overlooked. In fact, the Greek Septuagint name for the Chronicles, paralepomenon, means the things left over. So it's kind of set to the side. And in fact, sometimes when we think about the books of Chronicles in the New Testament, citations by New Testament authors that refer to Chronicles or might refer to Chronicles, we tend toward the parallel in the books of Kings and Samuel, because perhaps they're older and so forth. But Chronicles idealizes the reigns of David and Solomon, the golden era of Israel, has a central concern for the temple, and communicates divine retribution for apostasy despite persistent prophetic warning. We see this through as we read through the 2 Chronicles. And then when we come to the end of this text, 2 Chronicles 36:22-23, we see the Persian Emperor Cyrus come and give a commission to Israel to go and rebuild the temple. And that's how it ends. It's kind of an open end, and we're going to come back to that idea in a few minutes. Now, what about Matthew? Does Matthew use the book of Chronicles? Well, I covered those things. There's three areas which I would say we can see a chronistic pattern in Matthew's gospel. Number one, Chronicles likely provides at least one of the sources for Matthew's genealogy. Number two, we see this interesting text in Matthew 23:34-36. This is within Jesus' woes against the scribes and Pharisees in Jerusalem. And here he says, "Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of you will kill and crucify. Some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zachariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar." Now this event, most scholars look back to 2 Chronicles 24:20, the killing of Zechariah, the son of the high priest Jehoiada, who was also a prophet. That event is not, we don't find that in the books of Kings, only in Chronicles, which is interesting. So that probably means that at least in the gospel tradition, which Matthew seems to highlight here, that the Chronicles report is in view. And that event also was was recalled in Jewish tradition. We're going to again come back to this text a little bit later when we think about canon. But the third part here is a Jeremiah typology. So in the Old Testament, aside from the book that goes by his name, we don't find Jeremiah mentioned, only in Ezra and in Daniel, regarding the prophecy of the 70 years from the return of the exile. But Matthew is the only New Testament book to mention Jeremiah, which is very interesting. In fact, only in Matthew's gospel, when Jesus says, "Who do the people say that I am?" is Jeremiah mentioned. So there's a Jeremiah typology in Matthew's gospel that he may have, perhaps, picked up somewhat from the books of Chronicles. And now what I want to get, the main part of the presentation here that I'm summarizing for you from my paper, are that we have, at the end of Chronicles and the end of Matthew, two endings that look kind of similar, but they also display crucial differences. Now, let me just kind of remind you, Chronicles begins with a genealogy. and ends with a commission for restoration. Matthew begins with a genealogy, and what I'll argue is the Great Commission is a commission towards restoration in the Messiah. And that, in fact, Matthew is using Chronicles as a conceptual and structural model for how he concludes his gospel. So let's look at this text, 2 Chronicles 36:23, and there's the Septuagint from I think Sinaiticus Septuagint Greek. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. Okay, the Cyrus commission. Now, that's the Greek text. I'm going to, for the sake of time, we'll skip that and go to the English. 2 Chronicles 36:23 and Matthew 28:18-20. You can see I've highlighted in red some of the themes that are very similar, right? There's a structural correspondence with three things: authority, commission, and presence. So Cyrus appeals to the God of heaven. Now, just a reminder, Cyrus, the Persian emperor, pagan emperor, what is he called in Isaiah? The Mashiach, the servant. He's this. Why is he called these kind of terms? He's a pagan. He's not a Jew. Well, because he's the one who God uses to send Israel back to rebuild the temple. He's a temple builder, and that makes him, in a sense, a type of David, even though he's not the final type of David, you know. But in a sense, he's a type of David. He is sent to rebuild the temple. And so Cyrus says here, all authority on, the God of heaven, and the implication there, the God who is authority over all things, who is in heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. So we see the heaven and earth theme, the authority, right? And he has charged him to build him a house in Jerusalem. That is, to go back and to send the Jews back to rebuild Jerusalem, which had been destroyed in the Babylonian conquest. And then finally is the may the Lord God, the commission to presence, or the promise of presence. May they go up. Whoever is going to go up, the Lord God will be with them. We can see these similar patterns in Matthew's commission. Authority now on heaven and earth has been given to Jesus altogether. There's a commission to go, and there is the promise of his presence. And this is a theme in Matthew's gospel. We go back to the beginning. Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus is the one now in whom the divine presence who God is, and in whom God is fully present for his people. Okay, so just to summarize, we have two endings and two competing visions. Now, Chronicles, as a book standing by itself, as I said, some scholars of Chronicles say it's kind of a canonical history, and it's post-exilic. So remember, when Chronicles was written, there had been a return, a partial return, books of Ezra and Nehemiah, right? But still, as many New Testament and Second Temple Jewish scholars remind us, the Jews thought they were still in a form of exile. No, the promises of God had not been fully met. We see this in Matthew's genealogy, right? Abraham, three parts in the genealogy. Abraham, promise, covenant. David, promise, covenant. Exile, loss. He mentions Zerubbabel in the third part, but there's no comments about it. Rather what? The last 14 generations, the Christ, the Messiah. That's the restoration that was expected, the coming of Jesus. So as we see these two together, the structural, conceptual similarities, and also with them, we have crucial contrasts. The setting of Cyrus' commission is sending from the diaspora back to Jerusalem. Jesus and the disciples, remember, are gathered on a mountain in Galilee. And they are sent not back to Jerusalem to rebuild a temple, but out to the nations to make disciples. So ruling authority on heaven and on earth now is united in Jesus. Whereas Cyrus said, God is in heaven, he's given me authority on earth. Jesus says, I've been given all authority on heaven and earth. And this also communicates, right, the intersection of heaven and earth. And where was the intersection of heaven and earth previous? In the temple. Now it's in the person of Jesus. So what's communicated here also then, the third thing, or the next thing is there's an inversion of the commission. Not going back. The vision for restoration for Jews in the time period would have been going back to Jerusalem. And this will become especially prevalent after 70 AD. When the Romans came, right, their conquest of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple in 70, and in the post-70 period, the emerging rabbinic Judaism may have seen this ending Chronicles passage as a commission to aliyah, to go back up and rebuild the temple. In fact, Jewish scholar Isaac Kalimi, who's a Chronicles specialist, theorizes that this perhaps, that the tradition, the canonical tradition, if you're familiar with the canonical tradition, the order of the Hebrew canon, law, prophets, and writings, the last book of writings is Chronicles. So 2 Chronicles ends the Jewish canon. It's contested. Some argue, well, that we can't go back into the first century and know for sure that this canonical order was intact. But actually, the Matthew 23 passage I showed you a little bit ago, and I can't go into those details now because of time, is good evidence that at least there was a stream of tradition that had this kind of canonical shaping to it in the first century, because the martyrdoms of Abel and Zechariah would have provided a canonical framework for that, as Jesus says, from Abel to Zechariah. That would have been from Genesis to Chronicles. In any case, we have really an interesting possibility here that Chronicles, either as the ending of the book itself, or possibly even as the ending of the entire Hebrew canon, is this concluding message that the emerging rabbinic Judaism after 70 AD saw, and they said, what's our vision for restoration? Go back. Go back. Build the temple. So even though this was written a long time ago and it was put in the mouth of Cyrus, it still gets applied in the first century as a call for temple building. Interestingly, so if we think Matthew, who we know knows the Old Testament pretty well, knows this passage, and as I hopefully have shown, at least gave you a glimpse, I think we can say, use the books of Chronicles elsewhere in his writing. It's very interesting to see what he does with the Great Commission. In light of the Cyrus Commission, we have then a sort of contrast, similarity but contrast. And this is just kind of a little illustration. On the left of Cyrus Commission, appropriated perhaps by Judaism into the early first centuries, first and second century, the diaspora nations going, Israel in exile, going back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple for proper worship. But Jesus, in the commission in Matthew, at the end of Matthew's gospel, gathers the disciples outside of Jerusalem on the mountain in Galilee of the Gentiles. This would have been the place where the exile began in the Old Testament context. Jesus says, don't go back to Jerusalem, but rather go out to the nations. Now, I think Jesus meant also Judah and Jerusalem in his commission. But the point is, go out to Jerusalem. Divine presence is with you through me. And what's the task? It's disciple making. And what I'll also suggest is, we're talking about temple building in the New Testament sense, if you will have it. Go out and build the temple of God with the presence of the risen Messiah with you until the consummation of the age. And so, two competing visions for restoration in the first century. So you might ask, well, what does this have to do with discipleship? Good question, because it is a discipleship conference after all. What I want to suggest is this: the end of Matthew's gospel, here in my last minute, is a commission to renewal, a commission to restoration. An ongoing restoration during, the Jews felt they were in an ongoing exile. An ongoing call to restoration to the nations. So discipleship, in a sense, is an eschatological act. And what I want to suggest for a little bit of practicality here, I'm not talking about methods of discipleship. You are doing a great job with that. But what I want to give us is a framework, a story. We heard last night from our guest lecture back in OSEC, Jerry Root, inviting people into a story. And I think that's what Matthew is doing here. He's inviting his reader disciples into the story of eschatological renewal. and perhaps giving people a framework for that as disciple makers, to give them a vision. What are we about? We are about the process of renewal that Jesus commissioned us to. Thank you.